What if I told you that right now, someone is planning their next victim's route? That broken down car on the shoulder might not be an accident. That helpful stranger at the gas station might know more about you than they should. I'm about to share 11 road trip encounters where travelers barely made it home alive. If you're driving alone tonight, you might want to pull over for this one. Like this video if you've ever felt something was off during a road trip, and subscribe to Verified Fears because these stories will change how you see every mile marker, rest stop, and rearview mirror reflection. My name is Lilyana, and I need to tell you about something that happened to me 3 years ago. I still can't drive past mile marker 47 on I-80 without my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I was 24, fresh out of college with my psychology degree, driving from Ohio to Portland to start my dream job at a crisis intervention center. Ironic, considering I almost became a crisis myself. It was late July, one of those scorching Nevada afternoons where the asphalt shimmers like water and the sun feels like it's pressing down on your skull. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, windows down because my ancient Honda's air conditioning had given up somewhere outside Reno. The radio was crackling with static, and I hadn't seen another car for maybe 30 minutes. That should have been my first warning. I was singing along to some pop song when my engine started making this grinding noise, like someone was dragging metal across concrete. The temperature gauge was climbing into the red zone, and steam was beginning to curl up from under the hood. I pulled over at mile marker 47, right next to this faded sign that read, "Next services 78 miles." My heart sank. No cell service, obviously. Just endless desert stretching in every direction, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional buzzard circling overhead. I popped the hood, though I knew nothing about cars. The engine block was so hot I could feel the heat radiating against my face. Steam hissed from somewhere deep inside, and I realized I was completely screwed. That's when I heard the rumble of an 18-wheeler approaching from behind. The truck pulled over about 50 feet behind my car, air brakes hissing. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The driver who climbed down was exactly what you'd picture when you think helpful trucker, middle-aged, wearing a faded baseball cap and a plaid shirt, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had this grandfatherly way about him that immediately put me at ease. "Car trouble, miss?" he called out, walking towards me with his hands visible, non-threatening. "Name's Earl. I've been driving these roads for 23 years. Might be able to help." I explained my situation, and Earl nodded knowingly. He took a look under the hood, making appropriate concerned noises. "Blown radiator hose," he diagnosed. "Won't get you another mile in this heat. But don't you worry, I've got a spare hose in my truck. Been meaning to use it for something just like this." As he worked, Earl started making conversation. Friendly trucker small talk, or so I thought. "Portland, huh? Beautiful city. You ever been to Powell's Books? Massive place. Takes up a whole city block on Burnside Street." I was impressed. "Yeah, I've heard of it. I'm really looking forward to exploring the city." "Oh, you'll love the food scene too. There's this little Thai place called Pok Pok." Well, there was. Closed down a few years back, but the owner opened something new in the Pearl District. He paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "You mentioned you're starting a job? Psychology, wasn't it?" I froze. I hadn't mentioned my degree. I'd only told him I was moving to Portland for work. How did you know that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Earl didn't look up from the engine. Must have mentioned it. Memory's not what it used to be. But there was something different in his tone now. Less grandfatherly, more calculating. He finished with the radiator hose and filled my system with water from a gallon jug. That should get you to the next town, little place called Fernley, about 60 miles up the road. There's a good mechanic there, Jerry's Auto. Tell him Earl sent you, he'll take good care of you. I thanked him profusely, but something was nagging at me. As I got back in my car, Earl walked back to his truck, but instead of getting in, he pulled out what looked like a CB radio and started speaking into it in low tones. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard him say, "Mile marker 47 inches," and something that sounded like "college girl, psychology major, Honda Civic." My blood ran cold. I started my car quickly, grateful that it turned over, and pulled back onto the highway. In my rearview mirror, I watched Earl's truck follow suit, staying about a quarter mile behind me. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe we were heading in the same direction. But then I started thinking about our conversation. How had he known about my degree? And those specific details about Portland Powell's books, the exact street address, the restaurant that had closed and reopened, that wasn't general knowledge. That was the kind of information you'd get from researching someone specific. 20 minutes down the road, I passed a green highway sign, Fernley, next 3 exits. But as I approached the first exit, I noticed Earl's truck was gaining on me, closing the distance. My phone still had no signal, and the sun was starting to set, painting the desert an ominous orange. I took the first Fernley exit, and sure enough, Earl's truck followed. The town was smaller than I'd expected, basically just a main street with a few businesses, most of them looking closed or abandoned. I spotted Jerry's Auto exactly where Earl had said it would be, but the place looked like it hadn't been open in years. The windows were boarded up, and weeds were growing through cracks in the parking lot. Earl's truck pulled into the lot right behind me. This time when he got out, his demeanor had completely changed. The grandfatherly smile was gone, replaced by something that made my skin crawl. He approached my window with a confident stride, like he owned the place. "Looks like Jerry's closed up shop," he said. But he didn't sound surprised. "But don't worry, Lilyana. I know somewhere else we can get you fixed up proper." He'd used my name. I had never told him my name. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Earl's smile widened, and it wasn't friendly anymore. "Social media is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Amazing what people share online. Your Instagram's got some beautiful pictures from your graduation. Real proud family you got there. Your mom posted some nice shots of your car all packed up for the big move. License plate and everything." My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. "What do you want?" "Just want to help a young lady in distress," he said. But his eyes told a different story. "There's a motel just outside town, real private. We can wait there for parts to come in. Might take a few days, but I'll make sure you're comfortable." That's when I noticed the CB radio clipped to his belt was crackling with voices. I caught fragments. "Got her cornered," and "Bring the van around," and "Like we planned." I realized with crystal clarity that this wasn't random. Earl hadn't just happened upon a stranded motorist. He'd been following me, probably for hours, waiting for the perfect moment. The radiator hose hadn't blown naturally. Thinking back, I remembered seeing Earl's truck in my rearview mirror earlier, before my car overheated. He'd probably done something to cause the breakdown. "I think I'll try to make it to the next town," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Earl's friendly mask slipped completely. "Now, Lilyana, that wouldn't be smart. Your car's not going to make it another 10 miles, and it's getting dark. A lot of dangerous people on these roads at night." He was right about one thing. It was getting dark. But I was already looking at the most dangerous person on these roads. I made a split-second decision. You know what? You're right. Let me just grab my purse from the trunk. I got out of the car slowly, walking toward the back like I was going to get my things. Earl relaxed slightly, thinking he'd won. But instead of opening the trunk, I sprinted toward the main road as fast as I could run. I heard Earl shouting behind me, then the sound of his truck engine starting up. There was nowhere to hide in this flat desert landscape, but I could see lights in the distance. Maybe a gas station or diner. I ran toward those lights like my life depended on it, because I was pretty sure it did. Behind me, I heard not one but two vehicles. Earl's truck and something else. The voices on his radio weren't just random chatter. There were others involved in this, and they were coordinating. I reached a truck stop just as my lungs were about to give out. There were people inside, bright fluorescent lights, security cameras. I burst through the door, gasping and probably looking insane, and told the clerk to call 911. The police found Earl's truck parked behind Jerry's auto, but he was gone. When they searched the vehicle, they found zip ties, duct tape, and a cooler full of ice and bottled water. The kind of supplies you'd need to keep someone alive during transport. They also found a notebook with my full name, my college information, my new employer's address, and detailed notes about my travel route. Later, I learned that Earl had been using social media to target young women traveling alone. He'd caused their breakdowns, offered help, then lured them to isolated locations. I was the lucky one who got away. 3 other women hadn't been so fortunate. I never did make it to Portland that week. I flew instead and had my car shipped. Even now, 3 years later, I still check my rearview mirror obsessively. I've made all my social media private, and I never, ever accept help from strangers on the road. Because sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who looks like your grandfather, offers genuine help, and knows exactly how to make you trust him until it's almost too late. I'm Fletcher, and I need you to understand something about the year 1997. GPS wasn't a thing yet. We had paper maps, gas station directions, and pure dumb luck. What I'm about to tell you happened during what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway with my wife, Lilyana. We'd been married for 3 years, but things had gotten strained. Work stress, money problems, the usual stuff that slowly kills relationships. This trip was our last-ditch effort to reconnect. We'd booked a cabin in the Pocono Mountains for our anniversary weekend. I'd printed out MapQuest directions like everyone did back then. But somewhere around hour 4 of driving, Lilyana and I got into another stupid argument about finances. I was distracted, she was crying, and I missed our exit on Route 380. By the time I realized my mistake, we were deep in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by rolling hills covered in dense forest that seemed to swallow the late afternoon light. "Just turn around at the next intersection," Lilyana said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. She'd been doing that a lot lately, but the next intersection never came. The road just kept winding deeper into nowhere, with no shoulder to turn around on and trees pressing in on both sides like they were trying to close the gap behind us. The October fog was starting to roll in, thick and gray, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet ahead. That's when I saw the sign. Blackwood Road, population 247. It wasn't on any map, but there was an arrow pointing left down what looked like a decent-sized road. I figured it had to connect to something, maybe loop back to the main highway. "Fletcher, this doesn't feel right," Lilyana said as I made the turn. "We should go back." but going back meant admitting I'd gotten us hopelessly lost on what was supposed to be a healing weekend. My pride made the decision for me. It's fine. Small town. Someone can give us directions. The fog got thicker as we drove down Blackwood Road. The asphalt was cracked and patched in places, like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. We passed a few scattered houses, but they looked wrong somehow. The windows were too dark, the yards too empty. No cars in driveways, no lights on despite the approaching dusk. After about 10 minutes, we reached what I guess you'd call the town center. There was a single main street with a handful of buildings. A general store, a diner called May's Place, a small post office, and a gas station with pumps that looked like they belonged in a museum. The weirdest part was that all the buildings looked like they were from different time periods. The general store had that 1950s aesthetic, the diner looked like something from the 1970s, and the gas station seemed frozen in the 1980s. "This place gives me the creeps," Alawan whispered. I parked outside the general store, and we sat there for a moment, engine running. Through the fog, I could see people moving around inside the buildings, but slowly, like they were underwater. A few locals stood outside May's diner, just watching us. Not waving, not approaching, just standing there staring at our car. "Maybe we should just ask for directions and leave," I said, finally feeling the same unease that Alawan had been expressing. We walked into the general store, and the bell above the door made this dull, muffled sound instead of the bright chime you'd expect. The store was dimly lit, with shelves stocked with products I hadn't seen in years. Brands that had been discontinued, packaging that looked vintage. Behind the counter stood a woman who might have been 40 or 70. It was impossible to tell in that lighting. "Help you folks?" she asked. But her voice sounded flat, like she was reading from a script. "We're lost," I said. "Trying to get back to Route 380. Can you point us in the right direction?" The woman stared at us for a long moment, then smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Route 380? Never heard of it. But don't you worry. Lots of folks come through Blackwood, and they all find what they're looking for eventually." Alawan grabbed my arm. "Fletcher, let's go." But as we turned to leave, the woman called out, "Your car's making some noise, though. Heard it when you pulled up. Might want to get that checked before you head back out on the road. Jake at the gas station can take a look." I hadn't noticed any noise, but now that she mentioned it, I could hear something. A faint knocking sound from the engine that definitely hadn't been there before. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I drove to the gas station. Jake was waiting for us like he'd been expecting our arrival. He was a thin man in coveralls that looked like they'd never been washed, with pale skin and eyes that seemed to reflect light like a cat's. "Heard you folks might need some help," Jake said, lifting the hood before I'd even turned off the engine. "Yep, there's your problem right there. Looks like your alternator belt's about to snap. Drive much further and you'll be stranded." I looked under the hood, but in the dim light and thick fog, everything just looked like a mess of metal and hoses to me. How long to fix it? Well, I'd have to order the part. Might take a day or two to get here. But May's got rooms upstairs from the diner. Clean sheets, home cooking. You'll be comfortable. Alawan was pulling on my sleeve. "Fletcher, please. Let's just take our chances with the car." But Jake overheard her. "Ma'am, I wouldn't recommend that. This fog's only getting thicker, and these mountain roads can be treacherous at night. A lot of curves, a lot of drop-offs. Had 3 accidents just last month. Terrible shame." Something about the way he said "terrible shame" made my skin crawl. There was satisfaction in his voice, like he was describing something pleasant. We ended up at May's diner, where May herself, a heavy-set woman with graying hair and suspicious eyes, showed us to a small room above the restaurant. The room smelled like old cigarettes and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. The window looked out over the main street, and I could see our car parked at Jake's station. "Dinner's at 6, May said. "We close the kitchen at 7 sharp, so don't be late." After she left, Alawan and I sat on the bed in silence. The fog had gotten so thick that we could barely see across the street. The town felt impossibly quiet, like sound was being absorbed by the mist. "Fletcher, look at this," Alawan said, pointing to the nightstand. There was a guest book, the kind you might find at a bed and breakfast. She flipped through it, and I read over her shoulder. The entries went back years, all from travelers who'd gotten lost and ended up in Blackwood. But what was strange was the dates. Some entries were from the 1980s, others from the 1990s. But they all had the same few comments. "Extended our stay due to car trouble." "Jake's working on our transmission." "Waiting for parts to arrive." The most recent entry was from 1995, 2 years ago. A couple from New Jersey writing about how they'd planned to stay one night, but had been there for 4 days due to various car problems. "Fletcher," Alawan whispered, "what if they never left?" I was about to dismiss her concern when I heard voices from downstairs. Through the thin floorboards, I could make out May talking to someone. Another couple. Same as always. Jake's already started on their car. Should keep them here at least a week. My blood went cold. I gestured for Alawan to stay quiet, and we both pressed our ears to the floor. Getting low on supplies again. Haven't had fresh visitors since spring. These two should last us through winter if we're careful. I didn't want to understand what they meant by supplies or last us through winter. But my mind was connecting dots I desperately didn't want to connect. We had to get out of there. Now. I looked out the window and saw Jake still working under our car's hood. But in the dim light from his garage, I could see he wasn't fixing anything. He was actively removing parts, disconnecting wires, ensuring our car would never start again. "Alawan, we need to leave. Right now." We grabbed our overnight bag and crept down the back stairs. The diner was empty, but I could hear voices in what sounded like a basement or cellar. Through a partially open door, I glimpsed stairs leading down into darkness, and the smell that had been bothering me upstairs was much stronger here. It was the smell of meat going bad. We slipped out the back door into the fog. The night was so thick I could barely see my own hands, but I knew we had to get to our car. If Jake had sabotaged it, maybe I could reconnect whatever he disconnected. But as we crept toward the gas station, flashlight beams started cutting through the fog behind us. Voices called out, May, Jake, and others I hadn't seen before. "They're trying to leave," someone shouted. "Don't let them get to the road." I grabbed Alawan's hand, and we ran blind into the fog, away from the voices, away from the lights. Behind us, I could hear what sounded like an entire town mobilizing, people spreading out to search for us. We stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours, branches tearing at our clothes, roots catching our feet. The fog muffled everything, including our pursers, so we never knew how close they were. Finally, impossibly, we saw lights ahead. Real lights, highway lights. We burst out of the tree line onto Route 380, exactly where we'd started hours earlier. A state trooper was parked at the intersection, probably wondering why two people had just emerged from the forest looking like they'd seen death itself. When we tried to tell him about Blackwood, about the town, and the people trying to keep us there, he looked at us like we'd lost our minds. He drove us back to where we said we'd made the turn, but there was no Blackwood Road. No sign, no intersection, just solid forest stretching into the fog. The trooper took us to our cabin and suggested we'd gotten confused in the fog, maybe suffered from some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and disorientation. But I know what we experienced. And I know we left our car behind in that place, with Jake working on it, keeping it broken so the next lost travelers would be stranded just like we were supposed to be. Sometimes I wonder if Blackwood is still out there, waiting in the fog for the next couple having relationship problems, the next family that takes a wrong turn. And sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas on foggy nights, I make sure to never, ever take any road that isn't clearly marked on my GPS. Because some places don't want you to leave, and some towns feed on more than just tourism. My name is Kaysen, and what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 19, running away from everything I'd ever known. It was December 2003, and I was driving my beat-up Camaro from Dallas to Los Angeles, with nothing but $300 in cash and a desperate need to put as much distance as possible between myself and my father's fists. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, surviving on gas station coffee and pure adrenaline, when my car started making this grinding noise somewhere in the middle of New Mexico. It was 3 a.m. when I limped into the parking lot of the Desert Rose Diner, my engine smoking and my heart sinking. The place looked like something from a postcard about vintage America neon sign buzzing against the desert darkness, chrome and glass facade, and those big windows that let you see everything inside. There were maybe 6 cars in the parking lot, mostly long-haul truckers getting late-night meals, and the warm yellow light spilling out into the cold desert made it look like salvation. Inside, the diner had that timeless feel that truck stops always have. Red vinyl booths, checkered floor, and the smell of bacon grease and coffee that's been brewing too long. Behind the counter stood a waitress who looked like she'd been working the night shift for decades. Her blonde hair teased up high and her makeup applied with the precision of someone who'd perfected the look years ago. "Car trouble, honey?" she asked, and her name tag read Dolores. Her smile seemed genuine enough, but there was something tired in her eyes, like she'd seen too much of life's darker side. I explained my situation, and Dolores nodded sympathetically. "Bobby's our mechanic. He doesn't come in until 7, but he's real good with engines. You can wait it out here if you want. Coffee's fresh, and I make a mean apple pie." The other customers barely looked up when I slid into a corner booth. There was an older trucker reading a paperback novel, a middle-aged woman in a business suit staring at her laptop, and a young couple sharing a plate of fries. Normal late-night diner crowd, nothing unusual. I ordered coffee and pie, figuring I'd try to get some sleep in my car once the caffeine wore off. But as the night wore on, things started feeling off in ways I couldn't quite pinpoint. For one thing, none of the other customers left. The trucker kept reading the same page over and over. The businesswoman's laptop screen never changed, like she was staring at a frozen image. The young couple whispered to each other, but I never heard actual words, just the soft murmur of voices that could have been saying anything or nothing. Around 4 a.m., Dolores started doing things that seemed normal on the surface, but felt wrong somehow. She cleaned tables that were already spotless, refilled coffee cups that weren't empty, and kept glancing at the clock like she was waiting for something specific to happen. When I asked for my check, she waved me off. "Don't worry about it, sugar. You're having a tough night. Coffee's on the house." That should have been a relief, but instead it made my skin crawl. Nobody gives away free food at a truck stop, especially not to broke teenagers who look like runaways. The weirdest part was the phone calls. Every 20 minutes or so, the phone behind the counter would ring, and Dolores would answer with the same phrase, "Desert Rose, we're open all night." But then she'd listen for a moment and say, "Not yet, still waiting." Always the same response, like she was giving status updates to someone. By 5 a.m., I was seriously considering sleeping in my broken-down car rather than staying inside the diner. That's when I noticed that two of the other customers, the businesswoman and the older trucker, had stopped moving entirely. Not sleeping, not resting, just sitting completely still, staring at nothing, like mannequins posed to look like they were having a late-night meal. I got up to use the restroom, partly to stretch my legs and partly to get a better look at the other customers as I walked past. The young couple was still whispering, but as I got closer, I realized they were repeating the same conversation over and over, like a loop. "Do you think we'll make it to Phoenix by morning?" "Sure we will, baby. Just a few more hours." "Do you think we'll make it to Phoenix by morning?" "Sure we will, baby. Just a few more hours." In the men's room, I splashed cold water on my face and tried to convince myself that I was just exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I came back out, there was a new customer sitting at the counter, a man in a trucker's cap who definitely hadn't been there when I went in. He was eating a piece of pie, but he cut each bite with mechanical precision, chewed exactly 15 times, then took a sip of coffee. Cut, chew 15 times, sip. Cut, chew 15 times, sip. "Dolores," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "what time did you say the mechanic gets in?" She looked at me with that same tired smile, but now there was something else in her expression, something calculating. "Oh, Bobby should be here soon. Real soon. Why don't you have another cup of coffee while we wait?" I noticed she didn't actually answer my question about the time. And when I looked at the clock on the wall, the hands seemed to be moving backwards. It read 4:30, but I was sure it had been past 5 just a few minutes ago. That's when the phone rang again. Dolores answered with her usual greeting, listened for a moment, then said something different. "Yes, he's still here. Young, dark hair, looks like he's got cash. Came in around 3. She was looking right at me when she said it. My blood turned to ice. I stood up slowly, trying not to look panicked, and walked toward the door like I was just stepping outside for some air. But as soon as I touched the handle, Dolores called out, "Leaving so soon, honey? Bobby's almost here." Just a few more minutes. All the other customers turned to look at me then, and I realized they all had the same expression. Predatory, hungry like wolves who'd been patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. The businesswoman's laptop screen was completely black. The trucker's book was upside down. The young couple had stopped their repetitive conversation and were staring at me with unblinking eyes. "I just need some air," I said, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. "Sit back down, Kaysen," Dolores said, and that's when I knew I was in real trouble. I had never told her my name. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door felt like it was sealed shut. Behind me, I heard chairs scraping against the floor as the other customers stood up. When I turned around, they were all walking toward me slowly, and their movements were perfectly synchronized, like they were marching to the same unheard rhythm. Now, Dolores said, coming around the counter with something in her hand that looked like a small club or blackjack. No need to be difficult. We've been waiting all night for you. The trucker with the mechanical eating habit spoke for the first time. Been a slow week. Not many travelers with cash. That's when I understood. This wasn't a real diner. These weren't real customers. This was some kind of elaborate trap designed to catch vulnerable people like me, runaways, drifters, anyone who wouldn't be missed right away. The customers were bait, meant to make the place look normal and safe. And I'd walked right into it. I threw my shoulder against the door with everything I had, and finally it gave way. I tumbled out into the cold desert air and ran toward my car, keys already in my hand. Behind me, I could hear Dolores shouting, "Bobby, he's getting away!" I turned the key and prayed to whatever gods protect stupid teenagers. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar. Whatever had been wrong with it before seemed to have miraculously fixed itself, or maybe desperation gave it new life. I floored the accelerator and tore out of that parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. In my rearview mirror, I saw them all standing outside the diner, watching me go. But here's the thing that still gives me nightmares. They weren't moving like angry people who just lost their prey. They were moving like disappointed actors whose performance had been interrupted. Dolores was talking on what looked like a cell phone, probably calling ahead to the next truck stop down the line. I drove until sunrise, until I reached Albuquerque and the blessed sight of real traffic. Real people, real life. When I called the state police to report what had happened, they told me there was no Desert Rose Diner on that stretch of highway. Never had been. But when I described the location, the officer got quiet for a moment. "Son," he said finally, "you're the third person this year who's called about something like that. We've sent patrols out there, but there's nothing but empty desert. Just be more careful about where you stop at night, okay? I made it to Los Angeles, started a new life, put myself through college. I'm 39 now, married with kids of my own. But I still won't stop at 24-hour diners in the middle of nowhere, especially ones that look too perfect, too welcoming, because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who've learned to mimic safety so perfectly that you don't realize you're being hunted until it's almost too late. And sometimes, when I'm driving late at night through empty stretches of highway, I wonder how many other travelers have seen that neon sign buzzing in the darkness, felt that wave of relief at finding shelter, and walked through those glass doors never to be seen again. My name is Kalani, and I need to tell you about something that happened when I was 16. Something that still makes me check every door lock in my house before I go to bed. It was January 2001, and my family was driving back from my great-aunt's funeral in Pittsburgh. The whole trip had been tense. My parents had been arguing about money again, my little brother wouldn't stop kicking the back of my seat, and everyone was emotionally drained from 3 days of family drama and grief. We were somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia when the snow started falling. Not the gentle, pretty kind of snow you see in movies, but thick, aggressive flakes that immediately started accumulating on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. Dad was getting frustrated because traffic on the interstate had slowed to a crawl, and we still had 4 hours of driving ahead of us. "There's got to be a faster way through these mountains," he muttered, squinting at the road signs through the storm. Mom was navigating with one of those big road atlases, the kind that folded out across your entire lap, running her finger along various routes and shaking her head. "Marcus, just stay on the interstate," she said. "I know it's slow, but at least it's maintained." But Dad had already made up his mind. When he saw a sign for Route 32 that promised a more direct path through the mountains, he took the exit without another word. Mom sighed and started refolding the map, muttering under her breath about stubborn men and their shortcuts. At first, Route 32 seemed fine. It was a 2-lane highway that wound through pine forests heavy with snow, and there was barely any traffic. Dad was pleased with himself, driving maybe 10 miles over the speed limit despite the conditions. "See," he said, "we'll be home 2 hours early." But then the road started climbing into the mountains proper, and the curves became sharper, the grades steeper. The snow was falling harder now, and the road didn't seem to have been plowed recently. Our headlights carved out a small cone of visibility in the white darkness. And beyond that, there was nothing but the suggestion of steep drops and dense forest. That's when we saw the sign. Unmarked road, local traffic only. But by then, Dad was committed to his shortcut, and turning around on those narrow mountain curves would have been more dangerous than continuing forward. So we kept going, deeper into the mountains, deeper into the storm. After maybe 30 minutes of driving through increasingly treacherous conditions, we came around a sharp curve and saw a house. It was the first sign of human habitation we'd encountered since leaving Route 32, sitting about 50 yards off the road in a small clearing. The house looked old but well-maintained, with warm yellow light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. Most importantly, there was a driveway that had been recently plowed. "Thank God," Mom said. "We can ask for directions." Dad pulled into the driveway, and we all sat there for a moment, engine running, windshield wipers fighting the snow. The house had that cozy, inviting look that you associate with mountain cabins and friendly locals who help stranded travelers. There was even a wooden sign by the front door that read, "The Hendersons, Visitors Welcome." "I'll go ask," Dad said. But Mom put her hand on his arm. "We'll all go. It's too cold to leave the kids in the car." So we trooped up to the front door, snow crunching under our feet. The porch light was on, and I could hear what sounded like a television or radio playing softly inside. Dad knocked, and we waited. No one answered. He knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? We're lost and could use some directions." Still nothing. But the lights were on, and I was sure I could hear movement inside, like someone walking around on creaky floorboards. "Maybe they can't hear us over the storm," Mom suggested. Dad tried the door handle, and to our surprise, it turned. The door swung open, and warm air rushed out to meet us, carrying the smell of wood smoke and something else. Something that made me wrinkle my nose. "Hello," Dad called into the house. "Is anyone home? We're stranded travelers." The interior of the house was dimly lit, furnished with older furniture that looked comfortable but worn. There was a fire crackling in the fireplace, and a half-eaten meal sat on the kitchen table. 2 place settings. Food still warm, like whoever lived there had just stepped out for a moment. But here's what made my skin crawl. Everything in the house looked normal, except for the photographs. There were family pictures on the mantel and side tables. But in every single photo, the faces had been carefully cut out with scissors or a knife. Neat, precise circles where people's faces should have been, leaving only the suggestion of bodies in family poses. "This is weird," my little brother Tommy whispered. And for once, I agreed with him completely. Mom was looking at the meal on the table. "This food is still hot. Where did they go?" That's when we heard it. A car engine starting up somewhere behind the house. Dad walked to the back window and peered out into the darkness. "There's a barn back there," he said. Looks like someone's leaving. But instead of driving away, the vehicle, it sounded like a truck, drove around to the front of the house. We heard it pull into the driveway behind our car, blocking us in. Maybe that's the owners coming back, Mom said. But her voice had gotten smaller, less certain. Through the front window, I could see headlights illuminating our car. But the truck just sat there, engine running, like whoever was inside was watching the house. Waiting. Dad opened the front door and called out, "Hello, we're inside your house. Hope that's okay. We're lost in the storm." The truck's engine shut off, but no one got out. The headlights stayed on, shining directly through the front windows of the house, making it impossible to see who was inside the vehicle. "This doesn't feel right," I whispered to Mom. She nodded, pulling Tommy closer to her. "Marcus, I think we should go." But when Dad tried to walk out to the truck, the engine started up again, and the vehicle backed up slightly, like whoever was driving didn't want to be approached. The headlights stayed fixed on the house and on us. That's when Tommy, being 8 years old and curious about everything, wandered into what looked like the house's main bedroom. A few seconds later, he screamed. We all rushed to see what was wrong, and what we found made my stomach drop into my shoes. The bedroom looked like a tornado had torn through it. The mattress was off the bed and propped against the wall, stained with something dark. Clothes were scattered everywhere, drawers pulled out and overturned. But worst of all, there were long scratches in the wooden walls, like someone had clawed at them desperately, trying to escape. On the nightstand, there was a car registration form. I could see enough of it to make out the names. A middle-aged couple from Ohio who had apparently been traveling through the area just like us. "We need to leave," Mom said, her voice tight with fear. "Right now?" But when we went back to the front door, the truck had moved again, parking directly behind our car. There was no way we could back out of the driveway without hitting it. Dad grabbed a flashlight from our emergency kit and walked toward the truck, calling out, "Look, we don't want any trouble. We're just lost, and we'll be on our way." The truck's high beams suddenly flicked on, blinding him. In that harsh white light, I could barely make out two figures in the front seat, but I couldn't see their faces. They just sat there, watching. "Dad, come back inside," I called out, surprised by how scared I sounded. That's when we heard the sound that still haunts my nightmares. A low, mechanical grinding noise coming from somewhere behind the house. It sounded like heavy machinery starting up, like a wood chipper or some kind of industrial equipment. Mom grabbed the house phone to call 911, but the line was dead. No dial tone, nothing. "There's got to be a back door," she said, and we searched frantically until we found it. But when Dad opened it, we could see the barn behind the house, and that's where the grinding noise was coming from. Bright work lights illuminated the interior, and I could see the silhouette of someone operating what looked like large machinery. The grinding noise stopped abruptly, and whoever was in the barn started walking toward the house. "Upstairs," Dad whispered. Now, we crept up to the second floor and found a bedroom with windows overlooking the front yard. From there, we could see our car trapped in the driveway, the truck blocking our escape, and now a third figure walking around the side of the house carrying what looked like tools. They were surrounding us. That's when Dad made a decision that probably saved our lives. "We're going out of the window," he said. "There's a roof over the porch. We can climb down." It was terrifying. Climbing out a second-story window in a snowstorm while unknown people moved around the house below us. But one by one, we made it down to the porch roof, then dropped into the snow beside the house. We couldn't get to our car, so we started walking back toward the road. staying in the tree line where the snow would muffle our footsteps. Behind us, I could hear voices calling out, flashlight beams sweeping the yard. It took us 3 hours of walking through the storm before we reached a state police station. When we told them what had happened, they immediately sent officers to the house. But by the time they arrived, the place was empty. No truck, no people, no evidence of the machinery we'd heard in the barn. But they did find the registration papers for that couple from Ohio. And when they ran the names, they discovered that the couple had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier while traveling through West Virginia. They never found them. We never did learn what exactly was happening at that house or who those people were. The police investigation went nowhere, and eventually it was filed away as an unsolved case. But I know what we experienced, and I know how close we came to becoming another missing family that vanished on a mountain road during a snowstorm. I'm 28 now, and I have a family of my own. But I will never, ever take shortcuts through unfamiliar territory, especially in bad weather. And I teach my children that just because a house looks welcoming, just because the lights are on and there's smoke in the chimney, doesn't mean the people inside have good intentions. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how to make themselves look like salvation when you're lost and desperate and running out of options. My name is Zachariah, and I'm about to tell you why I will never, ever share a ride with a stranger again, no matter how desperate I am for money. This happened in the summer of 2015, when I was 22 and broke as hell. I just finished my junior year at Northwestern, but my student loans weren't covering everything, and my parents had made it clear they couldn't help with expenses anymore. When I saw a Craigslist post offering to split gas money for a ride from Chicago to Denver, it seemed like a godsend. The post was simple and straightforward. Driving to Denver this weekend, leaving Friday morning, arriving Saturday evening. Clean car, good driver, just looking to split gas costs. References available upon request. The guy's name was listed as Mark, and when I called him, he sounded normal. Maybe mid-30s, polite, asked reasonable questions about my schedule and confirmed I was serious about sharing expenses. We agreed to meet at a Starbucks near campus, and he'd pick me up from there. Mark showed up exactly on time, driving a clean Honda Accord that looked maybe 3 years old. He was average height, brown hair starting to thin on top, wearing khakis and a polo shirt like he worked in an office somewhere. The kind of person you'd sit next to on a plane and forget about 5 minutes later. His car was immaculate inside. No fast food wrappers, no personal items scattered around. Even the floor mats looked like they'd been vacuumed that morning. "You must be Zachariah," he said with a friendly smile. "Ready for a road trip?" For the first 2 hours, everything was perfectly normal. Mark was a good driver, stayed within the speed limit, used his turn signals religiously. We made small talk about college, jobs, the weather. He told me he worked in insurance and was visiting his sister in Denver for her birthday. I told him about my summer internship plans and how I needed to get back to school with enough money to survive the semester. But somewhere around hour 3, when we were deep into Iowa farmland with nothing but cornfields stretching to the horizon, Mark started making comments that set off alarm bells in my head. "You know what's interesting about long drives like this?" he said, adjusting his rearview mirror slightly. "You get to really observe people's behavior patterns. Like, I've been watching this blue sedan behind us for the last 50 miles. Same driver, same distance, never passing, never falling behind. Makes you wonder what they're thinking about." I turned to look, and there was indeed a blue sedan, maybe a quarter mile back. But it was an interstate highway, Of course, there were other cars traveling in the same direction at roughly the same speed. Probably just coincidence, I said. Mark nodded thoughtfully. Probably. But I've done this drive maybe 15 times in the past year, and you start to notice patterns. Same rest stops where certain types of people congregate. Same stretches of road where cars break down. Same places where people disappear. The way he said disappear made my skin crawl. There was something almost wistful about it, like he was remembering something pleasant. Disappear? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Oh, you know how it is, Mark said, glancing at me in a way that lasted just a beat too long. College kids hitchhiking, people carpooling with strangers they met online. Sometimes they just never make it to their destination. Families file missing person reports, but on a route this long, with this many small towns and empty spaces, well, a person could vanish pretty easily if someone wanted them to. I was starting to feel genuinely uncomfortable. That's pretty dark, man. Mark laughed, but it didn't sound natural. Sorry, occupational hazard. I deal with insurance claims all day, including life insurance. You see the statistics on highway disappearances, and it makes you think. Did you know that over 600,000 people go missing in the U.S. every year? Most are found within 48 hours, but thousands just vanish forever. He reached into his console and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through it while steering with one hand. I caught glimpses of handwritten entries, dates, locations, what looked like physical descriptions. What's that? I asked. Just notes from my drives, he said. I like to keep track of interesting encounters, you know? People I've given rides to, conversations we've had. Memory isn't what it used to be. He found the page he was looking for and glanced at it, then at me. Let's see. Zachariah, 22, Northwestern student, brown hair, about 5'10", traveling alone, told his roommate he'd be in Denver by Saturday night. He looked up at me with that same too long stare. Did I get that right? I had never told him those details. Definitely not about what I'd told my roommate, and I was pretty sure I hadn't mentioned my height. How do you know all that? I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. Mark smiled, and for the first time, it looked genuinely pleased. Social media is amazing, isn't it? Amazing how much people share online. Your Facebook profile is pretty detailed, Zachariah. Lots of photos with friends, information about your school, your internship plans. Even found some pictures from your high school graduation. Your parents looked so proud. My blood turned to ice. I had never given Mark my last name, which meant he couldn't have found my Facebook profile unless he'd been researching me beforehand. Which meant this wasn't a random carpool arrangement. I think I want to get out at the next rest stop, I said, trying to sound casual but probably failing completely. Oh, we're not stopping for a while yet, Mark said. I like to make good time. Besides, we're having such a nice conversation. Tell me, Zachariah, have you ever wondered what it would be like to just disappear? To have everyone you know spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to you. I looked at my phone and saw that I had no signal. We were in one of those dead zones that exist all over rural Iowa, miles from the nearest cell tower. Even if I could call for help, we were surrounded by empty farmland with nowhere to run. Mark reached into his door pocket and pulled out what looked like zip ties. I've been doing this for 3 years now, he said, his voice taking on a dreamy, nostalgic quality. Started with hitchhikers, but Craigslist ride shares are so much better. People actually pay me to get into my car with me. They tell their friends exactly when they're leaving and when they expect to arrive, which makes the timeline so much cleaner. He held up the zip ties, like he was showing me a souvenir. The thing about insurance work is that you learn how investigations actually work, what evidence matters, what gets overlooked. Did you know that if someone disappears from an interstate highway, jurisdiction becomes really complicated? Local police, state police, FBI. Everyone assumes someone else is handling it. I was calculating my options, which were basically non-existent. We were traveling at 70 miles per hour on a highway with no shoulder, no exits visible ahead, and no other cars close enough to help. If I tried to grab the steering wheel or jump from the car, I'd probably die anyway. That's when I remembered something from a self-defense class I'd taken freshman year. Sometimes the best way to survive a predator is to make yourself seem like more trouble than you're worth. You know what's funny, Mark? I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. I actually lied about some stuff when we talked on the phone. He glanced at me, and I could see I'd gotten his attention. I didn't just tell my roommate about this trip, I told my girlfriend too, and her dad's a state trooper in Illinois. Really paranoid guy, he made me promise to check in every 2 hours with my exact location. I'm actually late for my second check-in right now. It was complete bullshit, but Mark's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. Also, I continued, that notebook you're keeping, that's going to be a problem. See, I study criminology, and one of the first things they teach you is that serial offenders always keep trophies. That notebook is going to be what gets you caught. Mark was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he said, "You're lying." "Maybe," I said, "but are you willing to bet your freedom on it? Because if anything happens to me, and they find that notebook in your car, you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. And prison is not kind to people who hurt college kids." We drove in silence for maybe 10 minutes, and I could see Mark wrestling with himself. The predator in him wanted to continue with whatever he'd planned, but the insurance adjuster in him was calculating risks and probabilities. Finally, we crested a hill, and I could see a rest area ahead. One of those big truck stops with a McDonald's and a gas station. Mark put on his turn signal. "I need to use the bathroom," he said. But his voice had lost that confident, predatory tone from earlier. The moment we parked, I grabbed my backpack and got out of the car. "Thanks for the ride," I said. "I think I'll catch a different ride from here." Mark didn't try to stop me, but as I walked toward the building, I heard him call out, "Zachariah, you might want to be more careful about what you post online. Never know who's watching." I spent the rest of the day at that truck stop, eventually catching a ride with a family who was heading to Colorado. I never reported Mark to the police because I didn't have his last name, license plate number, or any real evidence of his intentions. But 2 months later, I saw a news story about a college student who disappeared while carpooling from Chicago to Denver. The story mentioned that police were looking for information about anyone offering ride shares on Craigslist. The missing student's name was David. He was 21, traveled alone, and according to his roommate, he'd been picked up by someone named Mark driving a Honda Accord. They never found David, and they never found Mark. I'm 29 now, working in cybersecurity, and I make good enough money that I'll never again be tempted by free rides from strangers. But sometimes, when I'm driving long distances alone, I think about that notebook Mark was keeping, and I wonder how many names were in it. How many people got into that clean Honda Accord thinking they were just saving money on gas, never realizing they were climbing into a mobile hunting ground. Because the scariest predators aren't the obvious ones lurking in dark alleys. They're the ones who look normal, drive clean cars, and know exactly how to exploit our trust and our desperation for help. My name is Zyla, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the worst week of my life, when my brother Ford and I were driving to our grandmother's funeral in Minnesota. It was August 2012, one of those brutal Midwest heat waves where the temperature hits 105 degrees and the asphalt literally melts under your tires. We'd been driving for 6 hours through the endless nothingness of North Dakota, and our 10-year-old Toyota was starting to struggle with the heat. Ford was 24 then, 3 years older than me, and he'd always been the responsible one. When our grandmother passed unexpectedly, he'd immediately taken charge of the travel arrangements, the time off work, all the practical details I couldn't handle while I was grieving. We'd been close to our grandmother. She'd basically raised us after our parents died in a car accident when I was 12. Now she was gone too, and Ford and I were officially alone in the world. We were somewhere between Bismarck and Minot, in a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever through rolling prairie land. When the temperature gauge on our dashboard started climbing into the red zone, Ford had been watching it nervously for the past 30 miles, and when steam started rising from under the hood, he pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. "Shit," he said, popping the hood release. "I think we blew the radiator." Outside, the heat hit us like a physical force. The sun was directly overhead, blazing down from a cloudless sky that stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no shade anywhere, just brown grass, the occasional fence post, and heat waves rising off the asphalt like invisible flames. Our car sat there steaming and clicking as the engine cooled down, and I realized we were in serious trouble. Ford had his phone out, but of course there was no signal. We were in one of those dead zones that still exist all over rural America, miles from the nearest cell tower. The last town we'd passed was probably 40 miles behind us, and according to our map, the next one was even farther ahead. "Maybe someone will come by," I said. But even as I said it, I realized we hadn't seen another car in over an hour. We tried flagging down the few vehicles that did pass, but nobody stopped. A couple of semis, a pickup truck, an RV with out-of-state plates. They all just flew past us like we didn't exist. After an hour of waiting in that brutal heat, we were both getting seriously dehydrated despite the water bottles we'd brought. "We need to find help," Ford said. "There's got to be a farm or something around here." Looking around, I could see what might have been buildings in the distance, maybe 2 miles off the highway, shimmering in the heat haze like a mirage. It was our only option. We grabbed our water bottles and started walking across the prairie, leaving the highway behind. The grass was brittle and crunched under our feet, and within minutes, our shoes were full of dirt and seeds. The heat was overwhelming. I could feel sweat evaporating off my skin as fast as my body produced it, leaving me covered in a layer of salt. The buildings turned out to be an abandoned farmstead, a house, a barn, and a few outbuildings that looked like they'd been empty for decades. The house was a 2-story white clapboard structure with most of its windows broken out, and the barn was missing half its roof. But as we got closer, I noticed something that made my skin prickle despite the heat. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt yard, multiple vehicles, and recent, probably within the last few days. Someone had been here recently, despite the fact that the place looked completely abandoned. "Ford, look at this," I said, pointing to the tracks. He knelt down and touched the dirt. "These are fresh, like really fresh. Maybe from this morning." We approached the house cautiously. The front door was hanging off its hinges, but someone had recently cleared a path through the debris. Inside, the house was a disaster, broken furniture, water damage, years of neglect. But in the kitchen, sitting on a table that should have been covered in dust and debris, were 3 empty beer bottles and a bag of gas station snacks. The bottles were still cold. "Someone's been using this place," Ford said, and his voice had gotten quiet and tense. That's when we heard the sound of engines in the distance, multiple vehicles getting closer. We looked out through a broken window and saw dust clouds on the horizon, heading straight for the farmstead. 3 vehicles, 2 pickup trucks, and what looked like an ATV, all moving fast across the prairie. "Maybe they can help us," I said, but Ford grabbed my arm. "Zyla, look around this place. Look at those tire tracks. People don't just hang out at abandoned farms in the middle of nowhere unless they're doing something they don't want others to see." I realized he was right. This wasn't a place where good Samaritans gathered to help stranded travelers. This was a place where people came to do things they couldn't do in town, where no one would hear screams or ask questions. We ran toward the barn, looking for somewhere to hide. The structure was falling apart, but there was an old grain silo attached to the back that still had most of its walls intact. We squeezed inside just as the first truck pulled into the yard. Through gaps in the corrugated metal walls, we could see 3 men getting out of the vehicles. They were all wearing camouflage clothing and carrying what looked like hunting rifles. But they moved with the purposeful coordination of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. One of them, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, was talking on a handheld radio. "Yeah, we saw them walking across from the highway. Young couple, broke-down car. Should be here somewhere." My blood turned to ice. They'd been watching us, tracking us. Another man, younger with a baseball cap, walked over to the house. "Tracks lead to the front door, but they're not inside anymore." "Check the barn," the third man said. "If they're smart, they'll be looking for shade." They started moving toward our hiding spot, and I realized we were trapped. The silo had only one entrance, and they were between us and any possible escape route. Ford put his finger to his lips, and we pressed ourselves against the metal wall, trying to become invisible. The footsteps got closer, and I could hear them talking in low voices. "Boss said to keep this clean," one of them said. "Make it look like heat exposure. Happens all the time out here." "What about their car?" another asked. "Already handled. Bobby's towing it to the chop shop. By tomorrow, it'll be parts in 3 different states." I felt Ford tense up next to me. These weren't random criminals or even opportunistic predators. This was organized, professional. They had a system. That's when I heard the radio crackle again. "Unit 3, what's your status?" The man with the gray beard responded. "Still searching. But they're here somewhere. City kids. Probably never been in heat like this. Won't last long either way. They were talking about letting the desert kill us if they couldn't find us. And from the casual way they discussed it, this wasn't their first time. We stayed hidden in that silo for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The men searched the barn, the house, and the other outbuildings systematically. At one point, one of them stood directly outside our hiding spot, and I was sure he was going to look inside. But the heat was affecting them too, and eventually, they retreated to the shade of the house to drink water and plan their next move. That's when Ford made a decision that probably saved both our lives. He pulled out a small pocket knife and started working on the corrugated metal wall of the silo, loosening screws that had been rusted nearly through. After a few minutes, he'd created a gap just big enough for us to squeeze through on the side, facing away from the house. We crawled out into the blazing sun and immediately started moving away from the farmstead. staying low and using whatever cover we could find. The prairie that had seemed completely flat from the road actually had small rises and depressions that could hide us if we were careful. Behind us, we could hear the men getting more frustrated and aggressive. Their radios were crackling constantly now, and I heard mention of expanding the search grid and bringing in the dogs. They had dogs. We walked for what must have been 3 hours, paralleling the highway, but staying far enough away that we wouldn't be visible from the road. The heat was killing us. I was getting dizzy and Ford was stumbling. But we knew that stopping meant dying, either from exposure or from whatever those men had planned for us. Finally, impossibly, we saw buildings in the distance. Real buildings, with power lines and cell towers. Of actual town, not an abandoned trap. When we staggered into the sheriff's office in Minot, we must have looked like we'd crawled out of hell. The deputy who took our statement said they'd been tracking a group that preyed on stranded travelers, but could never get enough evidence to make arrests. They watch the highways, he explained. When someone breaks down in a remote area, they move in fast. Sometimes they cause the breakdowns themselves. Sugar in gas tanks, punctured radiator hoses. People just disappear, and we find their cars stripped and abandoned weeks later. Our car was never recovered, and when the police went back to check the abandoned farmstead, they found evidence of recent activity, but no trace of the men who'd been hunting us. I'm 29 now, and Ford and I are closer than ever. We both live in cities now, places where help is never more than a phone call away. But sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas and I see broken down cars on the side of the road, I wonder if the people inside know they're being watched. If someone is already coordinating a response, already planning to be the helpful stranger who offers assistance. Because the most terrifying predators are the ones who know that our first instinct when we're in trouble is to trust anyone who offers help. They understand that desperation makes us vulnerable, and they're patient enough to wait for the perfect moment when we have no other choice but to accept their kindness. And in places where the nearest help is 50 miles away and cell phones don't work, they know they have all the time in the world to do whatever they want with the people who trust them. My name is Soren, and after 20 years of driving 18-wheelers across this country, I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Drug runners, lot lizards, hijackers, every kind of scam and con game that exists in truck stop culture. But what happened to me on Highway 50 in Utah during the blizzard of February 2009 still makes me check my passenger seat 3 times before I'll pick up anyone, no matter how desperate they look. I'd been driving the loneliest road in America for most of my career. Highway 50 through Nevada and Utah, the route they call the loneliest road, because there's literally nothing but desert and mountains for hundreds of miles. In winter, it becomes something else entirely. A frozen hell where visibility drops to 0 and the wind chill can kill you in minutes. That particular February night, I was hauling electronics from Reno to Salt Lake City when the weather turned nasty fast. The blizzard hit around 10 p.m., somewhere between Ely and Delta. 1 minute, I could see the road clearly. The next minute, I was driving blind through a wall of snow so thick my headlights couldn't penetrate more than 10 feet ahead. The wind was howling across the desert, like something alive and angry, rocking my 80,000-pound rig like it was a toy. I'd been through winter storms before, but this one felt different, more violent, more personal. I was creeping along at maybe 20 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing, when I saw a figure stumbling along the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. What would anyone be doing walking on Highway 50 in a blizzard? But as I got closer, I could see it was definitely a person, moving erratically through the snow like they were having trouble staying upright. Basic human decency won out over trucker paranoia. I pulled over and hit the air brakes, then climbed down from the cab into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The temperature had to be well below zero, and the wind was driving snow horizontally across the highway. "Hey!" I shouted over the storm. "You need help?" The figure turned toward me, and I saw it was a man, maybe 30 years old, wearing just a light jacket and jeans. No hat, no gloves, shoes that looked more suitable for a night out in Vegas than a winter storm in the Utah desert. He should have been showing signs of severe hypothermia, shivering, confusion, slurred speech. Instead, he walked toward my truck with steady, purposeful steps. "Thank God," he said, and his voice was perfectly clear, no chattering teeth or stammering from the cold. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down about 10 miles back." Something felt off immediately. 10 miles in this storm would have been a death sentence for someone dressed like he was. Hell, 10 minutes outside without proper gear should have put him in serious medical distress. But he looked completely fine, just slightly out of breath, like he'd been jogging instead of fighting for his life in sub-zero conditions. "Get in the cab," I said, because whatever was wrong with this picture, I couldn't just leave someone out in that storm. "We need to get you warmed up." He climbed into the passenger seat of my Peterbilt with surprising agility for someone who'd supposedly been walking through a blizzard for hours. I cranked up the heat and offered him coffee from my thermos. But he waved it off. "I'm fine," he said. "Just grateful you stopped. Most people wouldn't." I got the truck moving again, struggling to keep it on the road in the whiteout conditions. My passenger sat quietly for a while, looking out at the storm, and I started to relax. Maybe he'd just been luckier than most, found some shelter, managed to stay warm enough to avoid hypothermia. That's when he started talking about the other drivers. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been picked up by a lot of truckers on this route. Amazing how many people break down out here. There was this woman last month, driving a little Honda. Picked her up right around mile marker 127. Sweet lady, kindergarten teacher from Colorado." I glanced at him. "She okay? Get her car fixed?" He smiled, and something about that expression made my skin crawl. "Oh, she's fine now. Not going anywhere, but she's fine." The way he said "not going anywhere" sent warning bells off in my head. I've got pretty good instincts about people after 2 decades of picking up hitchhikers, and this guy was setting off every alarm I had. Then there was the college kid, he continued, like he was reminiscing about old friends. Zachariah, I think his name was. Real nervous type, kept looking over his shoulder like someone was following him. Turns out someone was... My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The storm was getting worse, and I was starting to lose sight of the road completely. But I didn't want to stop with this guy in my cab. "You seem to know a lot about people who've gone missing on this route," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He turned to look at me then, and in the dim light from the dashboard, his eyes looked different somehow. Reflective, like an animal's eyes in headlights. "Missing," he said. "Who said anything about missing? I know exactly where they all are." That's when I noticed that despite being in a heated cab for 20 minutes, there was no condensation from his breath. In air this cold, everyone's breath should be visible, but nothing was coming from his mouth when he spoke. "You're not cold at all, are you?" I asked. He laughed, and the sound was wrong. Too loud, lasting too long. "Cold doesn't really affect me anymore. Heat doesn't either. Weather's just weather when you've got all the time in the world." I was starting to panic, but I'm a professional driver, and panic gets you killed on roads like this. I kept my voice steady and said, "All the time in the world for what?" To get to know people. Really get to know them. Their fears, their regrets, what they sound like when they realize nobody's coming to help them. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what looked like driver's licenses. A lot of them, held together with a rubber band like a deck of cards. Souvenirs, he said, flipping through them. Kindergarten teacher, college kid, insurance salesman, grandmother visiting her daughter. Amazing how many people travel this road alone. I could see enough of the licenses in the dashboard light to read some of the names, and my blood turned to ice. Sarah Martinez. I remembered that name from a missing person report that had been posted at truck stops along this route. David Chen, another missing person, last seen on Highway 50 in Nevada. "You killed them," I said, and it wasn't a question. "Killed?" He seemed genuinely puzzled by the word. That's such a limited way to think about it. I prefer to think of it as collecting. These people were alone, afraid, desperate for help. I gave them exactly what they needed, someone to pay attention to them, to really see them, to be with them in their final moments. He held up one of the licenses, studying it fondly. This one was special. A trucker just like you. 23 years on the road, thought he'd seen everything. He picked me up on a night just like this one. Blizzard so bad he couldn't see the road. Really fought hard at the end. Impressive stamina for a man his age. That's when I realized what I was dealing with. Not just a serial killer, but something worse. Someone who used the isolation and harsh conditions of Highway 50 as his hunting ground. Who deliberately chose the most vulnerable people in the most dangerous situations. I started looking for somewhere to pull over, somewhere with lights, other people, any kind of help. But we were in the middle of nowhere, in a storm that had cut visibility to almost zero. "You know what's funny?" he continued, oblivious to my growing terror. "People always trust truckers. They see this big rig, think professional driver, safe, reliable. Makes it so easy to get close to them." He leaned closer to me, and I could smell something wrong about him. Not the smell of someone who'd been walking in the snow, but something else, something organic and decayed. "I've been riding with drivers on this route for 3 years now," he said. "Amazing how many accidents happen in weather like this. Trucks jackknife, slide off the road, catch fire. Terrible tragedies. But the desert's good at hiding evidence. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to outrun him or fight him in the confines of the cab, I did something completely unexpected. I started talking about my family. "My daughter's getting married next month," I said, pulling out my wallet with one hand while steering with the other. "Want to see pictures?" It seemed to confuse him. He'd been building up to something violent, working himself into whatever mental state he needed to hurt me. But my sudden shift to normal conversation threw him off. "She's marrying a good guy," I continued, showing him pictures. "They're having the wedding in Salt Lake City. That's where I'm heading to pick up supplies for the reception." I could see him struggling with this information, like a predator trying to decide if prey was worth the effort. Serial killers, even the most organized ones, have psychological patterns. And disrupting those patterns can sometimes buy you time. 300 people are expecting me to deliver table linens by noon tomorrow, I said. If I don't show up, they'll send search teams. State police, probably helicopters once the storm clears. It was mostly true. I was hauling wedding supplies, and people were expecting delivery. But I was gambling that this guy's hunting strategy depended on choosing victims who wouldn't be missed quickly. We drove in tense silence for maybe 10 minutes, and I could feel him calculating risks versus rewards. Finally, up ahead, I saw the blessed sight of lights. A truck stop with other vehicles, other people. "This is my stop," he said suddenly, like we'd just been having a normal conversation. I pulled into the truck stop, and he got out without another word, walking into the storm like it was a pleasant summer evening. I immediately called 911 and gave them descriptions, license plate numbers, everything I could remember. But here's the thing that still haunts me. When the police checked the security cameras at that truck stop, they showed me getting out of my cab alone. No passenger, no second person, no one walking away into the storm. The licenses I'd seen him holding? I never found any trace of them in my cab. I still drive Highway 50, but never alone at night, and never in bad weather. And when I see hitchhikers or stranded motorists, I call for help instead of stopping myself. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing on a lonely road isn't the weather or the isolation. It's the passenger you pick up who knows exactly how to use that loneliness against you, and who's been perfecting his hunting technique for longer than you want to imagine. My name is Jolie, and what I'm about to tell you is why I haven't spoken to two of my closest friends in 8 years. And why I still can't drink anything I didn't open myself. This happened during spring break 2016, when I was 20 and stupid enough to think that the worst thing that could happen on a road trip was running out of gas money. I was a junior at Florida State, and my 3 best friends, Madison, Casey, and Emma, had planned the perfect spring break road trip to Panama City Beach. We'd been looking forward to it for months. Sun, sand, parties, and a week of freedom before diving back into finals and the real world. I was the designated driver for the first leg of the trip because I had the most reliable car and didn't drink much anyway. We left Tallahassee around noon on a Saturday, packed into my Honda Civic with enough luggage, snacks, and energy drinks to fuel a small army. The plan was to drive straight through to Panama City, maybe 6 hours of easy highway driving through the Florida Panhandle. What could go wrong? For the first few hours, everything was perfect. We had our playlist cranked up, Madison was documenting everything on social media, Casey was navigating, and Emma was in charge of snacks and entertainment. We were having the time of our lives, singing along to pop songs and making elaborate plans for our week at the beach. But around hour 4, we needed gas and decided to stop at this little roadhouse bar just off I-10 in rural Georgia. It wasn't the kind of place college girls usually frequented, more of a trucker and local crowd. But Casey insisted she needed to use the bathroom and stretch her legs. The bar was exactly what you'd expect. Dim lighting, country music, taxidermy animals on the walls, and a clientele that looked like they'd been there since the Carter administration. We got some stares when we walked in. 4 young women in spring break clothes definitely stood out in a place like that. But the bartender was friendly enough and pointed us toward the restrooms. While the others were freshening up, I ordered a Coke and some chips for the road. The bartender, a guy in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, seemed genuinely nice. He made small talk about where we were headed, wished us a safe trip, even gave me the chips for free because college kids need all the help they can get. When my friends came back, Madison ordered a beer even though she was supposed to be my backup driver, and Emma got a rum and Coke. Casey, who was always the cautious one, just got a bottle of water. I stuck with my Coke, sipping it while we sat at a corner table and planned the rest of our route. That's where everything started going wrong. About 20 minutes after we'd gotten our drinks, Madison started acting weird. Not drunk weird. We'd seen her drunk plenty of times, but confused and paranoid. She kept looking around the bar like someone was watching us, and when I asked if she was okay, she grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "Something's not right," she whispered. "That guy at the bar keeps staring at us, and I feel really strange." I looked over and saw a younger man, maybe late 20s, sitting alone and occasionally glancing in our direction. But it was a small bar. Everyone looked at everyone. It didn't seem particularly threatening. "You probably just need some food," I said. "Low blood sugar can make you paranoid." But then Emma started acting off too. She kept saying she felt dizzy and nauseous, which was weird because she'd only had one drink and was usually a heavyweight. Casey was fine, but she was getting increasingly worried about Madison and Emma. "We should go," Casey said. "Something's definitely wrong with them." I agreed, but when I tried to pay our tab, the bartender waved me off again. "Already taken care of," he said with that same friendly smile. "You girls drive safe now." We helped Madison and Emma to the car, and I figured they'd sleep it off on the drive to Panama City. But once we got back on the highway, things got much worse, much faster. Madison, who was sitting in the passenger seat, started having what I can only describe as a complete psychological breakdown. She was convinced that the car behind us was following us, that there were people in the back seat who weren't supposed to be there, that I was driving us somewhere dangerous instead of to the beach. "Turn around," she kept screaming. "This isn't the right way. You're taking us somewhere to hurt us." Emma wasn't much better. She was curled up in the back seat, alternating between sobbing and making these weird, repetitive movements with her hands, like she was trying to brush invisible insects off her skin. Casey and I exchanged terrified looks in the rearview mirror. Neither of us had ever seen our friends act like this, and we had no idea what was happening or what to do about it. That's when Madison tried to grab the steering wheel. "Stop the car," she screamed, lunging toward me while we were doing 70 on the interstate. "You're not Jolie. I know you're not Jolie." I had to fight her off while trying to keep control of the car, and Casey was trying to hold Madison back from the back seat. It was absolute chaos, and I was terrified we were going to crash and kill ourselves on some random stretch of Georgia highway. Finally, I managed to pull over at a rest area, and that's when things got really frightening. Madison jumped out of the car and started running toward the woods, convinced that we were trying to kidnap her. Emma was right behind her, but she was stumbling and falling, clearly not in control of her movements. Casey and I chased them down and managed to get them back to the car, but now Madison was actively violent. She was hitting and scratching anyone who came near her, screaming things that made no sense, completely detached from reality. "They put something in their drinks," Casey said, and suddenly everything clicked into place. Someone at that bar had drugged my friends. The friendly bartender, the free drinks, the guy who'd been watching us, it had all been planned. But the plan had gone wrong somehow, because we'd left before whoever had drugged them could follow through with whatever they'd intended to do. I called 911, and when the paramedics arrived, they immediately recognized the symptoms. Madison and Emma had been dosed with some kind of powerful hallucinogen, probably GHB mixed with something else. The EMTs said it was one of the worst cases they'd seen. Whoever had drugged them had used enough chemicals to seriously mess them up, possibly permanently. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that both of them had been poisoned with a cocktail of drugs designed to make them compliant and disoriented. The scary part was that the dosage was so high, it could have killed them if we hadn't gotten medical help quickly. The police investigation went nowhere. When they went back to the bar, the bartender claimed he didn't remember us, and there were no security cameras. The other patrons all said they hadn't seen anything unusual. It was like our entire visit had been erased from everyone's memory except ours. But here's the part that still gives me nightmares. 3 days later, while Madison and Emma were still in the hospital, Casey and I drove back to that rest area where everything had gone to hell. We wanted to retrace our steps, see if we could find any evidence the police had missed. In the parking lot, we found Madison's phone. She dropped it during her paranoid episode, and it had been sitting there for days. When we checked the recent calls, we found something that made our blood run cold. Someone had been calling her phone every few hours since we'd left the bar, always from blocked numbers, always letting it ring just long enough to go to voicemail, but never leaving messages. Like someone was tracking the phone, trying to figure out where we'd gone. Casey and I realized that the plan hadn't been to hurt my friends at the bar. The plan had been to drug them and then follow us, wait for us to pull over somewhere isolated when they started acting crazy. And then, well, we didn't want to think about what would have happened then. The only thing that had saved us was that I'd called 911 instead of trying to handle it ourselves. If we'd pulled over on some dark country road and tried to wait out whatever was happening to them, we would have been sitting ducks for whoever had been tracking Madison's phone. Madison and Emma eventually recovered physically, but the psychological damage took much longer to heal. Madison developed severe anxiety and panic attacks. Emma couldn't be around strangers for months without having flashbacks. Our friendship never really recovered from that night. How do you maintain normal relationships with people who've seen you at your most vulnerable and terrified? I'm 28 now, working as a nurse practitioner, and I've seen enough drug-facilitated assault cases to know how common they are and how rarely the perpetrators get caught. What happened to us wasn't random. It was a coordinated attack by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had probably done it before. The worst part is knowing that whoever targeted us is still out there, still operating, still looking for groups of young women stupid enough to stop at isolated bars and accept free drinks from friendly strangers. And the next group might not be as lucky as we were. So if you're ever traveling with friends, especially young women, please remember this. Predators don't always look like monsters lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they look like helpful bartenders who remember your order and give you free food. Sometimes they work in teams, with one person gaining your trust while another slips something into your drink. And if your friends start acting paranoid or crazy after visiting an unfamiliar place, don't assume they're overreacting. Trust their instincts, get them medical help immediately, and assume you're being followed until you can prove otherwise. Because the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand that our natural instinct is to trust people who seem kind and helpful, and who know exactly how to exploit that trust to put us in situations where no one can hear us scream for help. My name is Garrett, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the most important week of my life, when everything I'd worked for hung in the balance of a single job interview. It was August 2018, and I was driving from Phoenix to Seattle for what I knew was my last shot at turning my life around. I was 35, recently divorced, behind on child support, and desperate enough to drive across 2 states in a 15-year-old Ford with 200,000 miles on it because I couldn't afford airfare. The job was with a tech startup that was willing to overlook my patchy employment history if I could convince them I was worth the risk. It was the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice in a lifetime, especially for someone like me who'd spent the last 5 years bouncing between dead-end jobs and fighting a custody battle that had drained my savings account. I'd been driving for 8 hours straight through the desert heat when my transmission started making noises that no car owner ever wants to hear. A grinding, whining sound that got worse every time I shifted gears. By the time I limped into the tiny town of Millfield, Montana, the car was barely moving and billowing smoke from under the hood. Millfield wasn't even a town, really. Just a cluster of buildings around a single main street. The kind of place that exists solely because it's exactly far enough from anywhere else that travelers occasionally need gas or food. There was a diner, a motel that looked like it had been built in the 1960s and never updated, a general store, and thankfully, an auto repair shop with a hand-painted sign that read, "Eddie's Garage, honest work, fair prices." Eddie himself came out to meet me as I pulled into his lot, wiping his hands on a greasy rag and shaking his head at the sounds my car was making. He was maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face and oil-stained clothes that suggested he'd been fixing cars in this exact spot for decades. "Transmission's shot," he said after taking a quick look under the hood. "I can hear it from here. You're lucky you made it this far." I explained my situation, the job interview, the timeline, how desperately I needed to be in Seattle by Thursday morning. Eddie listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard similar sob stories countless times. "Well," he said finally, "I can fix it. Got the parts, got the time. But it's gonna be expensive, and it's gonna take a while." He quoted me a price that made my stomach drop. $2,800, which was more money than I had in my checking account. When I asked about payment plans or alternatives, Eddie scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Tell you what," he said, "I like you. You seem like a decent guy in a tough spot. How about we work something out? You stay in town while I fix your car. Might take 3-4 days to get it done right. And I'll cut the price in half. Call it $1,400. You can even work around the shop, help me out with some projects, earn a little of that back." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being stranded or missing my interview entirely. I agreed, and Eddie recommended I stay at the Pine Valley Motel across the street. "May runs a clean place," he said. "Tell her I sent you. She'll give you a good rate." The Pine Valley Motel was exactly as depressing as it looked from the outside. Thin walls, dated furniture, and a persistent smell of cigarette smoke and industrial disinfectant. But May, the elderly woman who ran the front desk, was friendly enough and did indeed give me a discount when I mentioned Eddie's name. "You'll like it here," she said with a smile that seemed genuine. "Quiet town, friendly people. Some folks come through and end up staying longer than they planned." That first night, I called the company in Seattle and explained my situation. My contact there was understanding but firm. The interview was scheduled for Thursday, and if I couldn't make it, they'd have to move on to other candidates. I had exactly 3 days to get my car fixed and drive 12 hours to Seattle. The next morning, I showed up at Eddie's shop ready to work. He put me to sweeping, organizing tools, and doing other odd jobs while he worked on my transmission. The work was honest enough, and Eddie seemed like a decent guy. But I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. For one thing, there were a lot of cars in various states of disrepair scattered around the property behind the shop. When I asked about them, Eddie said they belonged to customers who'd left town without paying their bills. "Happens more than you'd think," he said. "People get stranded, promise to send money, then disappear. I keep the cars until they pay up. But some of those cars looked like they'd been sitting there for years. Weeds were growing through the engine compartments, windows were broken, and license plates were from states all over the country. It looked less like a temporary storage situation and more like a car graveyard." On the second day, I started meeting some of Millfield's other residents. There was Bob, who worked at the general store and had supposedly come through town 5 years ago when his car broke down. There was Linda, who helped May at the motel and claimed she'd been just passing through in 2015 when her transmission failed. And there was David, who worked odd jobs around town and had arrived 3 years ago with engine trouble. They all had the same story. Car problems, met Eddie, decided to stay temporarily while repairs were made, then somehow never left. They all seemed content enough, but there was something hollow about their contentment. Like people who'd given up on their original dreams and settled for whatever life had offered instead. "It's not so bad here," Linda told me while I was getting ice from the motel machine. "Once you accept that you're not going anywhere, it becomes kind of peaceful. No stress, no deadlines, just simple living." But I didn't want simple living. I wanted my shot at that job, at a real future, at being able to provide for my daughter. On Wednesday morning, the day before my interview, I asked Eddie about the progress on my car. He wiped his hands and gave me the same patient expression I'd seen before. "Well, there's good news and bad news," he said. "Good news is I found the problem. Bad news is it's worse than I thought. Transmission's completely shot and the engine's got problems too. We're looking at another couple of days, maybe a week." I felt panic rising in my chest. "Eddie, I have to be in Seattle tomorrow morning. This is my life we're talking about." He nodded sympathetically. "I understand, I really do. But rushing the job won't do either of us any good. Tell you what, call your people, see if they can reschedule. These things happen. They'll understand." But when I called Seattle, the answer was firm. Thursday or nothing. The position needed to be filled immediately, and they'd already extended the timeline once for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the other temporary residents of Millfield, about the cars slowly rusting away behind Eddie's shop, about how quickly a few days could become a few months, then a few years. That's when I started paying closer attention to the details that had been nagging at me. Like how Eddie always seemed to have exactly the right parts in stock, no matter how unusual the repair. Like how the motel and diner always had room for stranded travelers, even though the town barely existed. Like how everyone I'd met had the same story about car trouble and deciding to stay. I slipped out of my motel room around midnight and walked over to Eddie's shop. The building was dark, but I could see the yard behind it where all those abandoned cars sat. With my phone's flashlight, I started looking at them more closely. What I found made my blood run cold. These weren't just random breakdowns. Someone had been systematically sabotaging vehicles, cutting belts, loosening connections, introducing contaminants into engines and transmissions. The damage was subtle but deliberate, designed to cause catastrophic failures that would be expensive and time-consuming to repair. But the worst discovery was in Eddie's office, where I found a filing cabinet full of repair estimates and invoices. Hundreds of them, dating back more than a decade, all following the same pattern. Travelers with expensive car problems, quotes for repairs that would take days or weeks, payment plans that somehow never got fulfilled. And at the bottom of each file, stamped in red ink, were the words "permanent resident" and a date. I realized that Millfield wasn't just a small town that happened to have a lot of stranded travelers. It was a trap, deliberately designed to capture people who were desperate enough to accept help from strangers. Eddie wasn't a mechanic trying to help people. He was the spider at the center of a web that had been catching flies for years. I ran back to my motel room and started packing immediately. I didn't care if I had to abandon my car. I wasn't going to become another permanent resident of Millfield, Montana. But when I tried to leave, I discovered that someone had slashed all 4 of my tires and poured sand in my gas tank. My car wasn't going anywhere. That's when I heard the knock on my door. It was Eddie, and he wasn't alone. May was with him, along with Bob and Linda and David, all the friendly locals who'd welcomed me to their little community. Going somewhere, Garrett? Eddie asked with that same patient smile. It's pretty late for a drive. My car won't start, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That's a shame, he said. But don't worry, these things happen. We'll get it fixed in the morning. Might take a while, though. Might take a long time. I could see in their faces that they all knew exactly what was happening. They'd all been through this same realization, this same moment of understanding that they'd walked into a trap. And they'd all made the choice to accept their situation rather than fight it. But I wasn't ready to give up. I pushed past them and ran, heading for the highway on foot. Behind me I could hear voices calling out, flashlight beams sweeping the darkness. But I kept running. I ran for 3 hours through the Montana wilderness until I reached a truck stop where I convinced a driver to give me a ride to the nearest city. I never did make it to that interview. By the time I was able to call Seattle, the position had been filled. But I was alive, and I was free, and I wasn't spending the rest of my life as a permanent resident of a town that existed solely to trap desperate people. When I reported what had happened to the authorities, they said they'd investigate, but I never heard anything more about it. And when I checked online maps later, I couldn't find any town called Millfield, Montana. But sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas and I see signs for small towns with auto repair shops, I remember Eddie's patient smile and May's friendly welcome. And I keep driving, no matter how badly my car might be running. Because I know that some kinds of help come with a price you can't afford to pay. Because the most dangerous traps are the ones that look like salvation when you're desperate enough to believe in them. My name is Scott, and I need to tell you about the worst mistake I ever made, which was letting my ego convince me that I could handle whatever some psycho in a pickup truck wanted to throw at me. This happened in 2005, when I was 28 and thought I was invincible. My best friend Armando and I were driving from Las Vegas to Phoenix for his bachelor party weekend. One last guy's trip before he got married and settled down into suburban domesticity. We'd been friends since college, and Armando had always been the calm, rational one while I was more of a hothead. He was the guy who talked me out of bar fights and bad decisions, while I was the one who pushed him to take risks and live a little. It was a good balance, usually, but that day, it nearly got us both killed. We were making good time on Interstate 10, cruising through the Arizona desert in my souped-up Mustang GT with the windows down and classic rock cranked up loud. It was one of those perfect desert days, bright blue sky, temperature in the low 80s, mountains stretching to the horizon in every direction. Armando was telling me about his wedding plans, while I half listened and enjoyed the feeling of 400 horsepower under the hood. That's when the black pickup truck appeared in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just another vehicle on the highway, maybe a quarter-mile back, traveling at roughly the same speed we were. But over the next few minutes, I noticed it was gaining on us gradually. And when it got close enough, instead of passing, the driver just stayed there, maybe 50 feet behind us, matching our speed exactly. That guy's been back there for a while, Armando said, glancing at the side mirror. I looked in the rear view and saw a lifted black Chevy with tinted windows and a light bar across the top. I couldn't make out the driver clearly, but I could see enough to tell it was a man wearing sunglasses and what looked like a baseball cap. Probably just going the same direction we are, I said. But something about the way the truck was maintaining that exact distance made me uncomfortable. When I sped up to 85, the truck sped up. When I slowed down to 75, so did he. When I changed lanes, he changed lanes right behind me, staying in that same position like we were connected by an invisible rope. Okay, that's weird. Armando said. Maybe try to lose him? I downshifted and punched the accelerator, and my Mustang shot forward like it had been fired from a cannon. The speedometer climbed to 95, then 100, then 110. For a moment, I thought we'd left the pickup behind. But when I checked the mirror, there he was again, keeping up effortlessly and maintaining that same 50-foot distance. That's when I realized this wasn't coincidence. Whoever was driving that truck was playing some kind of game with us. "What the hell does this guy want?" I said. But even as I asked the question, part of me was already getting excited. I'd always been competitive, especially when it came to cars and driving. And the challenge of outrunning someone was triggering all my worst instincts. The truck driver seemed to sense my change in attitude, because that's when he made his first aggressive move. He pulled out into the left lane and accelerated until he was right beside us, matching our speed perfectly. Through his tinted windows, I could see him turn his head to look at us, and even though I couldn't make out his face clearly, there was something menacing about his posture. He stayed there for maybe 30 seconds, keeping pace with us in the left lane, then suddenly swerved toward our car like he was trying to sideswipe us. I yanked the wheel to the right, tires squealing as we moved onto the shoulder to avoid collision. "What the fuck?" Armando shouted, grabbing the dashboard. The truck driver immediately fell back into position behind us, like nothing had happened. But now I was pissed. This wasn't just some random road rage incident. This guy was actively trying to hurt us, and he was treating it like a game. "Scott, just take the next exit," Armando said. "Let's get away from this psycho." But my pride was hurt, and my competitive instincts were in full gear. "No way. This asshole wants to play games? Let's play." I floored the accelerator and shot ahead, weaving between slower traffic like I was in a video game. The truck followed, staying right with me through every lane change and maneuver. When I took an off-ramp at the last second, trying to lose him, he took it too. When I got back on the highway, there he was again. What should have been a clear warning sign that this person was dangerous just made me more determined to win whatever contest we were engaged in. For the next 20 miles, it escalated into a full-blown highway chase. The truck driver would pull alongside us and try to force us off the road, and I'd respond by trying to outrun him or outmaneuver him. He'd brake check us when he was in front, and I'd pass him aggressively and cut him off in retaliation. Armando was getting increasingly panicked. "Scott, this is insane. Just let him go." But I was in that stupid male headspace where backing down felt like losing, and losing was unacceptable. I was going to show this guy that he'd picked the wrong target for his twisted game. That's when he started forcing us toward the exits. Every time we'd approach an off-ramp, the truck would position itself to try to push us toward the exit, like he was hurting us somewhere specific. When I'd resist and stay on the main highway, he'd get more aggressive, actually making contact with my car's bumper or side panels. "He's trying to get us off the interstate," Armando said. And for the first time, real fear was creeping into his voice. "Scott, I think this guy wants to get us somewhere isolated." I was starting to realize the same thing, but my pride wouldn't let me admit it. Instead, I kept fighting back, kept trying to outrun him, kept treating this like a competition instead of recognizing it for what it really was. A predator trying to separate us from other people and potential help. The truck driver's tactics were becoming more sophisticated and more dangerous. He'd box us in between slower vehicles, forcing us to reduce speed, then try to push us toward exits when we were trapped. He'd use other cars as obstacles, timing his moves to put us in maximum danger. And I was playing right into his hands, responding to every provocation instead of just getting away. Finally, about 50 miles outside Phoenix, he managed to force us toward an exit that led to a rural road through desert wilderness. I had a choice: take the exit or risk a head-on collision with his truck. At the last second, I chose the exit. Big mistake. The rural road was exactly what the truck driver had been maneuvering us toward. A 2-lane highway through empty desert with no other traffic and no services for miles. Perfect for whatever he had planned. As soon as we were on that isolated road, his behavior changed completely. Instead of the aggressive but relatively controlled highway games, he started actively trying to cause a serious accident. He'd ram us from behind, trying to send us into a spin-out. He'd pull alongside and swerve into us, trying to force us off the road and into the desert. "Oh God," Armando said. "He's trying to kill us." That's when I finally understood what I'd gotten us into. This wasn't road rage, or a territorial dispute, or even a random psycho having a bad day. This was a predator who used highway games to lure people into isolated areas where he could hurt them without witnesses. And I'd been so focused on winning our little competition that I'd driven us straight into his trap. The truck made one final, violent attempt to ram us off the road, and I lost control. My Mustang spun out and went sliding sideways across both lanes before slamming into a concrete barrier. The impact knocked the wind out of both of us and cracked my windshield, but we were alive. The truck had stopped about 100 yards behind us, engine idling, like the driver was deciding what to do next. That's when we heard the sirens. Apparently, other drivers had been calling 911 about the dangerous driving they'd witnessed on the interstate. A state police helicopter had been tracking us, and patrol cars were converging on our location. The truck driver must have heard the sirens too, because he suddenly gunned his engine and disappeared into the desert, leaving us shaken and stranded but alive. When the state trooper took our statement, he wasn't surprised by our story. "We've had reports about someone matching that description for the past 6 months," he said. "Black pickup, aggressive highway behavior, always tries to force people off into isolated areas. You're the first ones who lived to give us a detailed account." "The first ones who lived?" Armando asked. The trooper nodded grimly. "3 other incidents we can't quite connect to him, but the pattern's similar. People found dead in single-car accidents on rural roads, always after witnesses reported aggressive driving on the interstate. We think he's been hunting people, using highway games to separate them from help." I realized that if those sirens hadn't arrived when they did, Armando and I would have become statistics in someone's unsolved case file. I'm 36 now, married with kids, and I've never driven aggressively since that day. When someone tailgates me or cuts me off, I just let them go, because I learned that the most dangerous person on the road isn't necessarily the worst driver. It's the one who's using your competitive instincts against you. Some predators don't hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. They hunt on bright, sunny highways in broad daylight, using your own ego and pride to lure you into situations where no one can help you. And if you're the kind of person who can't back down from a challenge, who has to win every contest and prove every point, you're exactly the kind of prey they're looking for. My name is Naya, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the most heartbreaking week of my life, when I was trying to give my mother one final gift before Alzheimer's stole the last fragments of who she used to be. It was September 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and I'd made the difficult decision to take her on one last cross-country drive to see her sister in Maine before she forgot who any of us were. My mother, Elena, was 73 and in the early stages of dementia. Some days she was completely herself. Sharp, funny, full of stories about her childhood and advice about my life. Other days, she'd forget my name or think I was her sister or ask when my father was coming home from work, even though he'd been dead for 5 years. The doctors said we had maybe 6 months before she'd need full-time care, and I wanted to make those months count. The trip from our home in Denver to my aunt's house in Portland, Maine was ambitious. Over 2,000 miles through states that were still dealing with COVID restrictions and closures. But Elena had always loved road trips, and in her lucid moments, she was excited about seeing her sister one more time. I'd planned our route carefully, booking pet-friendly hotels since we were bringing her little terrier, Max, and timing our stops around her medication schedule. For the first 2 days, everything went perfectly. Elena was having a good stretch. She remembered stories from every town we passed through, sang along to oldies on the radio, and seemed genuinely happy to be on an adventure. We made it through Colorado and Kansas without incident, staying at a nice hotel in Topeka, where Elena charmed the desk clerk with stories about traveling as a young woman in the 1960s. But it was on the 3rd day, somewhere in Missouri, that I first noticed him. We'd stopped for lunch at a truck stop diner, one of those sprawling places with a restaurant, gas station, and gift shop all under one roof. Elena was having a bad morning, confused about where we were and why we were traveling. So I was focused on keeping her calm and oriented while we ate. That's when I saw the man at the counter. He was maybe 45, average height, wearing a baseball cap and a nondescript jacket. What caught my attention wasn't his appearance, but his behavior. He was watching us intently while pretending to read a newspaper. And when Elena got up to use the restroom, his eyes followed her with an interest that made me uncomfortable. When we left the diner, I noticed him getting into a dark blue sedan parked near our car. But truck stops are busy places with lots of travelers, so I didn't think much of it at the time. The next day, in Illinois, we stopped at a gas station to fill up and let Max stretch his legs. While I was pumping gas, Elena wandered toward the convenience store, moving slowly but purposefully. I was keeping an eye on her while watching the pump when I saw the same man from the Missouri diner. Same baseball cap, same jacket, standing by the air pump and watching Elena with that same intense focus. This time, I was sure it wasn't coincidence. I quickly finished with the gas and went to collect Elena, who was looking at candy bars with the confused expression she got when familiar things suddenly seemed foreign to her. As we walked back to the car, I glanced around and saw the blue sedan parked at the far end of the lot. "Elena, we need to go," I said, helping her into the passenger seat. "Why are you calling me Elena?" she asked, looking at me with genuine confusion. "That's my mother's name." One of her bad moments was starting, which was the last thing I needed when someone seemed to be following us. That night, at a Holiday Inn in Indiana, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. But when I looked out our second-floor window around midnight, I could see a dark sedan parked across the street in a McDonald's parking lot, positioned where the driver would have a clear view of the hotel entrance. I called the front desk to report a suspicious vehicle, but by the time hotel security went to check, the car was gone. The next morning, Elena was having one of her clearest days in weeks. She remembered where we were going and why, asked intelligent questions about our route, and seemed genuinely excited about seeing her sister. But when we stopped for breakfast at a family restaurant in Ohio, there he was again. This time, he wasn't even pretending to hide his interest. He sat at a table where he could see us clearly and spent the entire meal watching Elena. When she got up to use the restroom again, he immediately pulled out his phone and started texting someone. I was terrified. But I was also dealing with a 73-year-old woman with dementia who might not understand or remember if I tried to explain the situation. How do you tell someone whose grip on reality is already tenuous that you think you're being stalked? I decided to test my theory. When we left the restaurant, instead of getting back on the interstate toward Maine, I took a series of random turns through residential streets in downtown Columbus. Sure enough, the blue sedan followed every turn, staying about 2 blocks behind us. "Where are we going, dear?" Elena asked. "This doesn't look like the way to Sarah's house." "Just taking a scenic route, Mom," I said, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I drove to the Columbus police station and parked directly in front of the building. The blue sedan drove past without stopping, but I got a clear look at the license plate and the driver. It was definitely the same man who'd been watching us at multiple stops across 3 states. Inside the police station, I tried to explain the situation to a detective who looked like he'd heard similar stories before. He took down my information and the license plate number, but his expression suggested he thought I might be an overprotective daughter seeing threats where none existed. "Ma'am, it's possible this person is just traveling the same route you are," he said. "Interstate highways create coincidental encounters all the time." But when he ran the license plate, his attitude changed completely. The car was registered to someone with a criminal record that included multiple arrests for stalking and assault, with what the detective described as a pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I think you should be very careful. This individual has been suspected of following and harming elderly people, particularly those traveling alone or with limited family support." That's when I understood what was happening. Someone was targeting my mother specifically because she was elderly, confused, and traveling with just one caregiver. Elena's dementia made her seem like an easy victim, someone who might wander off, get separated from me, or be unable to accurately report what had happened to her. The police arranged for us to stay in Columbus that night under protective surveillance, and the next morning, 2 patrol cars escorted us to the Pennsylvania state line. I was grateful for the help, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our stalker was still out there, just waiting for the police protection to end. For the rest of the drive to Maine, I took elaborate precautions. I varied our route, made unexpected stops, and changed hotels at the last minute. Elena was confused by all the changes, but she seemed to sense my anxiety and became more clingy and dependent than usual. We made it to Portland safely, and Elena had a wonderful 2-week visit with her sister. The familiar surroundings and old photographs seemed to bring back memories that had been fading, and she had more clear, coherent days than she'd had in months. But on our drive back to Denver, the blue sedan appeared again. This time, I was ready for him. I'd bought a dash cam in Maine and had been documenting every mile of our return journey. When I spotted the familiar car following us through Pennsylvania, I immediately called state police and started recording everything. The police response was swift and decisive. They pulled over the sedan on Interstate 80 and arrested the driver, who turned out to be part of a larger network that targeted elderly travelers. They'd been using social media and public records to identify vulnerable people making long-distance trips, then following them to isolated areas where they could rob or assault them without witnesses. Elena never fully understood what had happened, which was probably a blessing. To her, it had just been a wonderful adventure to see her sister, with some confusing detours and extra police officers who were very nice to her. She passed away 8 months later, peacefully, in a memory care facility. But I'm grateful that her last big adventure was filled with joy and family connections rather than the horror that someone had planned for her. The man who'd been stalking us was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. During his trial, prosecutors revealed that he'd been targeting elderly people with cognitive impairments for over 3 years. specifically choosing victims whose conditions would make them unreliable witnesses. Advice: when traveling with elderly family members, especially those with cognitive issues, vary your routes and stops randomly. Trust your instincts if you notice the same person at multiple locations. Predators often target vulnerable travelers who seem like easy victims. What I learned is that some of the most evil people in the world are the ones who specifically prey on our most vulnerable family members, using their confusion and dependence to mask crimes that might otherwise be immediately obvious. And if you're caring for someone with dementia, you're not just protecting them from their disease. You're also protecting them from predators who see that disease as an opportunity.